The corridor at Halcourt Military Academy smells like floor wax and cold metal at 6 in the morning. The overhead lights run the full length without variation, and a clock above the water fountain marks time with a slow drip. At the far end, a mop bucket rolls in a straight line, pushed by a small woman in gray work clothes, moving through the space the same way every morning, without announcement, without hurry. She had cleaned this corridor 431 times. On the 432nd, she stopped mid-pass, tilted her head toward the training room door, and listened to something no one else in the building could hear. This is a story about what people miss when they decide someone does not matter. It runs across 3 parts, about 45 minutes total. If this is the kind of story you come here for, subscribe and stay close. Part 1 starts right now, and it does not waste your time. The lights at Halcourt Military Academy came on in sections. The maintenance wing first, at 5 o'clock, triggered by a timer in the basement mechanical room that the facilities department had set in 1987 and adjusted only once since. Then the administrative wing at 5:30. Then the academic corridor and training room wing at 6, all of it running off the same relay which clicked over on its schedule without knowledge of the season or the quality of light outside. In winter, the 6 o'clock lights came on in full dark, and the corridor held them in isolation for 40 minutes before anything outside began to compete. In late autumn, where the calendar now sat, the outdoor light was beginning at roughly the same time, thin and low-angled, arriving through the wire mesh corridor windows at the specific slant of early November mornings at this latitude. The corridor that ran the length of the training room wing was 230 feet from the main entrance junction to the east stairwell. Its overhead fluorescents were mounted in long ceiling fixtures and produced a white-blue light that flattened everything it touched, taking the color temperature of the walls and floor and cabinet doors and reducing them all to a common institutional register. White walls became slightly yellow. The gray linoleum floor went silver. The dark wood of the cabinet doors along the left wall read almost black. The reinforced glass in the high windows gave back a dim reflection of the overhead light rather than anything from outside, at least until the outdoor light strengthened enough to push through. The floor was linoleum, gray speckled, and it had been sealed and resealed over so many years that the surface held the overhead light the way still water holds a reflection, in long watery columns that shivered slightly whenever the ventilation system changed its cycle. The ventilation system at this hour ran at its lowest setting, moving air through the overhead grills at a speed that created a friction just below the threshold of conscious notice. You felt it as temperature rather than sound, a faint displacement of air across the top of the head. The grills themselves were painted steel, painted so many times the slats had slightly thickened, and the newest coat of paint was an off-white that had not quite matched the original, but had faded close enough over 2 years that the seam between the old and new surfaces was visible only in direct light. The smell in the corridor at 6:15 was composed of floor wax at the top, synthetic and faintly citrus, and beneath that, cold metal from the radiators along the wall that had been off since April and would not come back on until the maintenance schedule determined October had arrived. Beneath the floor wax and the cold metal was a chemical smell that was not added daily but was present daily. The accumulated residue of many years of cleaning solution applied to the baseboards and the linoleum seams and the junctions where wall met floor, soaked in and dried and soaked in again until it was part of the building's composition rather than something applied to it. Near the east stairwell, the smell changed. Paper from the supply office in the corner room, an old book smell from stored forms and requisition pads. Near the main entrance, colder and more mineral, outdoor air that had been trapped briefly in the entry vestibule each time the front door opened and carried in. The door to Training Room C was the third on the left. It was set slightly deeper into the wall than the adjacent doors, a feature of the wing's original construction that had never been explained in any document anyone currently working at Halcourt had seen. The door had a narrow, reinforced window at head height, its glass wired in the standard grid pattern, and a brushed steel lever handle worn smooth at its curve from many thousands of uses. The door was closed. The room beyond was dark and quiet. The corridor outside it was empty. A clock hung on the wall above the water fountain near the corridor's midpoint. It was round-faced, black-rimmed, the kind produced for institutional use by manufacturers who understood that durability and legibility mattered more than aesthetics in buildings that would be maintained on a budget. Its second hand moved in discrete mechanical ticks rather than a smooth sweep, so that each second announced itself as a distinct event. In the silence of the corridor before the day started, each tick was audible. The water fountain below the clock had a slow drip, reported twice to the facility's management queue and not yet repaired, that struck the drain cover every 8 seconds. The combination of the clock's ticks and the fountain's drip created a layered interval sound in the corridor's ambient quiet. The two rhythms slightly out of phase with each other so that sometimes they coincided, and sometimes they alternated, and sometimes they produced a third interval between them that had no particular name, but that the human ear tracked anyway, out of the same instinct that finds patterns in rain. At 19 minutes past 6, the mop bucket appeared at the main entrance junction, rounding the corner into the corridor. Its front left wheel had a wobble that pulled slightly left, requiring a small, persistent correction to keep the bucket tracking in a straight line down the corridor. The woman pushing it applied the correction without looking down at the wheel. Her gray work clothes, dark pants, and a collarless zip-front top in a slightly lighter shade were clean and pressed in the functional way of someone who maintained their work clothes with the same consistency they brought to everything else that required maintenance. She wore thin work gloves, the color of old paper, and the elastic at the wrists had gone soft from repeated washing, so that they sat on her hands rather than gripping them. Her hair was white and cut short, and the overhead light caught it from above without shadows. She was small, 5'2", perhaps 5'3", with the posture of someone who had learned not to accommodate their height through apology or compensation, but had simply settled into it as a fact. Her name was on a laminated card clipped to the supply caddy on the lower rack of the cart. Keller, R. The lamination had yellowed slightly from proximity to the cleaning solutions. She did not look directly at the floor while she worked. This was the primary visual difference between someone who had done this work for a long time and someone who had not. New custodial workers watched their mop heads, tracked the surface they were treating, responded to what the floor showed them. Ruth watched the space ahead of the mop head instead, reading the corridor's conditions from the forward position, the way a driver reads the road from ahead of the car rather than beneath it. Her eyes moved in a regular, unhurried pattern. Floor ahead, middle distance, the corridor's edges where the angle of the light from the high windows showed what the center passes would miss. She adjusted the mop's path from this forward position, making corrections before they were needed. Her route through the corridor had organized itself through repetition into a fixed sequence she had never written down. First pass down the left, covering the wall-adjacent floor, where the cabinet doors created a gap between the wall's baseboard and the main working area. Second pass up the right, covering the window side floor with its slightly different surface quality. The linoleum here faded a half shade lighter from the years of morning light through the high windows. Third pass down the center, the longest pass, to pick up the dry lines that parallel passes always left at their outer edges if the overlap was insufficient. The overlap needed to be 6 inches, less than 6 inches, and the dry lines were visible in certain light. More than 6 inches, and you were redoing work that was already done. 6 inches was the number. The scuff mark near the training room door had been there for 3 weeks. It sat at the baseboard level, a dark arc approximately the width and curve of a boot heel, pressed into the linoleum rather than sitting on its surface. She had applied the appropriate solvent twice, working it in with a detail brush, and both applications had lifted the topmost layer of the mark without removing it entirely. The mark was structural, part of the linoleum surface now, not a deposit on top of it. She had submitted a work order for a linoleum patch. The work order was in the queue. The linoleum seam near the water fountain had been lifting for 6 weeks. One corner of the seam had separated from the substrate beneath and risen perhaps 3 millimeters, not enough to be a trip hazard under ordinary circumstances, but enough to catch a mop head if you ran the pass at the wrong angle. She had also submitted a work order for this, also in the queue. When she reached this section of the corridor, she redirected the mop head automatically to approach the seam from the angle that cleared it, a small adjustment that she made without looking at the seam directly, the way you stop looking at a familiar obstacle and simply navigate it. The water fountain dripped. She had reported this as well. At 6:34, the east stairwell door opened, and Hendrick came through with a cart loaded with paper supply boxes, his twice-weekly restocking run for the supply office and the training room wing storage. He was in his mid-40s, heavy-set, with the specific gait of someone who had been managing knee pain for long enough that the compensation had become the posture. He moved through the corridor the way Ruth moved through it, without registering it consciously, because he had been through it enough times that his body navigated by an internal map rather than by looking. He nodded as he passed. Ruth lifted her chin slightly. He continued to the supply office at the east end, the door opening and closing behind him. They had spoken, over 3 years, the words necessary to communicate about the facility's request queue, the condition of the supply closet shelving, and once, briefly, about a severe thunderstorm warning that had made working under a metal roof feel unwise. 300 words, perhaps, over that span, possibly 350. The exchanges were not unfriendly. They were the particular economy of two people who understood their work without needing to discuss it, and who understood each other's position in the building's architecture without needing to name it. They were the people who maintained the space where other people did the thing the space was for. He came back through at 7:12 with the empty cart, the return nod, and was gone through the stairwell door. At 7:15, the building's sounds began to shift. Not loudly. The difference between the building at 6:30 and the building at 7:15 was a matter of density rather than volume. More sounds, more sources, beginning to layer over each other rather than sitting in separate registers. Voices from the upper floors, muffled by the ceiling and the stairwell's mass. The main entrance door, at 7:20, opening twice in quick succession, and then twice more in the next 5 minutes. Each opening sent a brief mineral draft down the corridor before the pneumatic closer sealed it again. A door somewhere on the floor above, opening and closing. A chair sound from one of the administrative offices at the building's front. The building was putting on its working day, the way a building does this, incrementally, from multiple points at once. Ruth had completed her first and second passes of the first 2 sections and was beginning the third section, the one that ran along the training room wing proper, when she heard the cadets at the main entrance corner. Voices first, male and female both, carrying in the way that voices carry in institutional corridors when the speakers have not yet calibrated for the space's acoustics. Then footsteps, multiple sets, different weights and rhythms, and the group came around the junction corner into the corridor. 8 of them, in the standard academy work dress of dark pants and light shirts, ID lanyards, the specific texture of people who had been managing pre-exam energy since before they got here and had settled it into a kind of alert normalcy. 1 carried a coffee cup, 1 had a phone, 2 were already arguing. The argument was between Thibodeau and Oyalaran. Thibodeau was the taller of the 2, tall and broad through the shoulders, 19 or 20, with a face that was still in the process of deciding what kind of face it would be, caught in the interval between what adolescence had made and what adulthood would eventually settle. He argued with the energy of someone who had committed to a position before examining whether the position was correct, which meant his energy was invested in the commitment rather than the reasoning. Oyalaran was shorter, more contained, with the particular quality of someone who had learned to let other people exhaust themselves before responding. He listened to Thibodeau with the flat attention of a person who had already concluded the argument was over and was now simply waiting for the other person to arrive at the same conclusion. The argument concerned a practice assessment score. Thibodeau's position was that his answer had been technically correct and had been marked down in error. Oyalaran's position, delivered in precise, unhurried sentences, was that addressing the right general category through the wrong specific application was not a grading error, but an accurate mark. The specific application in question involved energetic materials, and in that context, the distinction between category and application was not a formality. Ruth moved the bucket left to let the group pass. Behind the arguing pair, Ferreira and Brzezinski walked close together in the manner of people continuing a conversation they had started before entering the building and had not finished. Their voices were low, and Ruth caught no words, only register. Reyes had the coffee cup and held it at a position and angle that communicated he would not be parting with it. Mansouri had the phone and had not looked up from it. Lay was near the front of the loose cluster, moving with the directness of someone who wanted to be inside the training room rather than still in the corridor traveling toward it. At the rear of the group, slightly separated from the others by a consistent 3 or 4 feet, was Nuafor. He was not excluded from the group. He was simply maintaining a different spatial relationship to it. The kind of slight remove that some people carry as a natural condition, being part of something and also at a small angle to it. He moved through the corridor with his eyes running a scan, clock, training room door, supply caddy, the water stain near the fountain, Ruth. He noted her in the same pass that noted everything else. His expression did not change. His scan continued. Most of the group passed without their attention landing on her with any weight. The gray work clothes and the mop bucket and the cart put her in the category of building infrastructure. And building infrastructure did not require acknowledgement, any more than the clock on the wall or the cabinet doors required acknowledgement. This was not malice. It was the ordinary social physics of institutional spaces, the arrangement that made it possible for the building to function as a background and a foreground simultaneously. The background people keeping the foreground available for the people whose work required it. Then the glove slipped. It was the left one, and the slip happened because the elastic at the wrist had been washed enough times to lose its tension, and when she repositioned the bucket to clear the last of the group, The worn wrist material caught on the bucket handle's upper lip and pulled back. For 2 or 3 seconds, the back of her right hand was visible. 3 fingers, thumb and first 2, and where the ring finger and the small finger had been, old scar tissue, smooth and pale, drawn slightly tighter at the closure line than the surrounding skin. She adjusted the glove back with a short motion of her other hand and continued. Thibodeau had stopped walking. She registered his stop through the change in the group's movement rather than by looking at him. The group had been moving. Now there was a hesitation, a turbulence in the passage, and the sound of his footsteps ceased. She was looking at the floor ahead of the mop head. "Hey," Thibodeau said. He said it to the group, not to her, in the way that comments about people standing nearby are directed to anyone in earshot except the subject. "Did you see that?" He made a gesture she saw in her peripheral vision, a waggling of his own hand to indicate the missing fingers. "She's missing 2 fingers." A beat, then a short social laugh, reflexive, from somewhere in the middle of the group. Ferreira from the register. "How do you even grip a mop like that?" Thibodeau continued. He had found his audience and was working it. "No, seriously. That's a basic equipment operation question. If you can't close your hand around the handle properly, the technique is compromised. It's just physics." Oyalaran had stopped and turned back, but he was looking at Thibodeau rather than at Ruth, and his expression had shifted slightly from the flat attention of before to something more specific and less neutral. Thibodeau took 2 steps in Ruth's general direction. Not toward her exactly, toward the subject of his observation, which happened to be where she was. "I'm saying, when they do the hiring for this kind of position, is there a minimum? Like, physically? Because on a military installation, you'd think there would be protocols." He paused, calculating his next line. "Kitchen accident, probably. You'd think she would have asked for a desk job." Brzezinski was smiling. Reyes had lowered the coffee cup. Newfor was not smiling. He was standing with his arms crossed at his chest, the contained way rather than the confrontational way. And he was watching Thibodeau with an expression she caught only at the very edge of her peripheral attention. She did not spend time on it. The bucket was between her and the group, slightly forward of her position as she had set it down to complete a short section. Thibodeau stepped forward and his boot caught the bucket's side. The contact was precise enough to be deliberate and imprecise enough to be deniable. The calibrated ambiguity of someone who wants to do a thing and wants to retain the option of saying they did not do it. The bucket went over. The 2 gallons of solution spread across the linoleum in a fast-moving front, reaching the right-hand baseboard in under 4 seconds and beginning to run along its slight depression and sending a slower arm to the left toward the cabinet doors. The sound of the water hitting the linoleum was significant in the quiet corridor. Thibodeau looked at the water. He looked at Ruth. "Somebody should be more careful," he said, directing it to no one in particular and everyone in general, and turned and walked to the training room door and through it. The door closed. Ruth stood for a moment. The water had reached the right-hand baseboard and was running along the wall in the direction of the water fountain. The arm toward the cabinet doors had reached the first cabinet and was moving into the gap beneath it. The sound of the water on the linoleum had given way to the sound of water finding the baseboard's low point and following it. She went to the supply caddy and removed the backup absorbent cloth. She shook it out flat and laid it across the main body of the spread. Then she removed the smaller cloth from the caddy's secondary pocket and set it at the baseboard where the running water was collecting. She righted the bucket. She assessed the solution level remaining, under a quart. She would need to refill. Newfer was still in the corridor. He had not followed the others through the door. He was standing near the training room entrance, not positioned there for any deliberate reason Ruth could identify, just standing, with his eyes moving between the water on the floor and the cloth she had laid and her. He had his arms still crossed in the contained way. He looked at her. Something moved in his face that was not quite the beginning of a sentence and not quite an expression. His lips parted slightly. The incomplete thing he was about to say stayed incomplete. He arrived somewhere in it and did not continue through to the other side. His mouth closed. He looked at the floor again, and then at the training room door, and then at the floor, and then he went through the training room door, and the door closed behind him. Ruth carried the bucket to the supply room at the east end, refilled it at the utility sink, waiting for the tap water to come up to the temperature needed for the solution to activate properly. She measured the concentrate. She capped the bottle. She returned it to its shelf position. She carried the bucket and mop back to the corridor. She ran 2 full passes over the section where the water had been. The first pass pulled the standing moisture out. The second pass brought the surface to the correct finish, which she checked by looking across the linoleum from a low angle, using the light from the high window to read the surface's evenness. The surface came out even. She rinsed the cloth in the bucket, wrung it, returned it to the caddy. There was a quality to the work after something like what had just happened. She had identified it a long time ago, in contexts where this quality had been professionally useful rather than merely personally familiar. It was not anger. Anger moved outward and distributed itself. This moved inward, a narrowing, a concentration. Everything available in her came down to the immediate task and only the immediate task. The mop's weight in her hands, the surface's response to the angle of the pass, the 6-inch overlap. She knew the quality well enough not to examine it. She let it do what it did. She continued her route. The fourth section, the supply corridor, back through to the main corridor for the final pass along the window side wall. Around 9, a second group of cadets arrived through the main entrance, smaller, 4 of them, dispersed over a 10-minute window rather than arriving together. One of them held the main entrance door for Hendrick, who was coming back through on a second supply run with a different cart. 2 of the cadets nodded in Ruth's direction as they passed. One of them she didn't know by name. They went into the training room. The sounds inside reorganized briefly around their arrival and then settled again. At 8:15, by the corridor clock, Lieutenant Adeze Obina came through the main entrance with a 2-wheel hand dolly and a sealed metal transport case. She was moving at the pace of someone slightly behind their own schedule, the walk of a person who is not late yet and is committed to not becoming late. She was in her late 20s with the posture of someone who had spent years in contexts where posture was observed and had subsequently maintained it in contexts where it was not, because by then it was no longer a performance but a default. She moved through the corridor reading it the same way Ruth read it, without stopping on any one thing, processing the space and everything in it in a continuous sweep. The transport case on the dolly was metal, gray painted, the size appropriate for demonstration equipment. Both visible sides carried the standard stenciled markings, Inert Training Demo / Disposal Education, in black on the gray surface, with the standard safety orange inspection stripe running along the case's base. The 2-point latches at the front were both in the closed position. The case showed the evidence of regular rotation through the Academy's training cycle, dented corners, a repair bracket clamped over a hairline crack in the right handle, a rectangle of sticker residue on the upper left surface where a label had been removed and not replaced. The dolly under it was scratched and scuffed in the way of institutional hand trucks, its rubber platform worn smooth at the center from the accumulated compression of many loads. The case's dolly required Obina to navigate around Ruth's bucket. She angled the dolly left. Ruth moved the bucket right. The case cleared the bucket with clearance on both sides. "Morning," Obina said. "Morning," Ruth said. Obina had been offering this exchange since September of the previous year. It had become consistent enough over 9 months to be a fact about the corridor rather than a daily decision. 2 syllables and eye contact. Every morning she was assigned to this wing. The eye contact was direct and brief and continued. Not the performed eye contact of someone making an effort, but the ordinary eye contact of someone who saw the person they were speaking to and had no reason to look elsewhere. Ruth understood what this meant and what it did not mean. It meant that Obina registered her as a person in the room and chose to acknowledge the registration. No more and no less. And no less was not small. Obina maneuvered the dolly through the training room door, getting the case's angle right to clear the door frame. The door closed. Inside, over the next several minutes, the sounds organized into the texture of class preparation. The 2-point latches on the transport case releasing, the resistance of the heavy-duty lid hinges as the case opened. Equipment being moved from the case to the demonstration table's surface, one item at a time, with the specific placement sounds of equipment being set in a planned arrangement rather than simply unloaded. Obina's voice, low, giving brief instructions that established the order of events for the session. Chairs adjusting as the cadets oriented toward the front. Then a settled period, the sounds of a group under instruction, which had a particular texture distinct from the sounds of a group left to itself. The instructional register had a directional quality, one voice setting cadence and the others quiet. Ruth could hear it through the door as she worked the section outside. Not the words, just the quality. She completed the 4th section and took the mop cart through the supply corridor for that run. When she came back through at approximately 9:15, Obina's footsteps were in the corridor, quick, moving toward the supply office. The supply office door opened and closed. The sounds from the training room shifted, not dramatically, a modulation rather than a change, the way a key signature can change and take a bar or two before the ear registers it consciously. The directional quality of the instructional register was gone. In its place was the more diffuse texture of a room that had been left to itself. Multiple voices at different volumes. A chair moving in a way that indicated someone getting up rather than adjusting position. The general redistribution of attention into informal modes. The level of ambient sound rose slightly, as it always did when the organizing presence left the room. She was working the water fountain section, maneuvering around the lifted seam, when she heard Thibodeau's voice above the room's ambient noise. The register was the performing register, holding court, pitching for a laugh. She caught no words. She did not try to. Then she heard the other sound. It was underneath the room noise, below Thibodeau's voice and the chairs and the ambient conversation. A mechanical sound, stepped rather than continuous, each iteration identical to the last. A click with a specific quality. A hard initial contact followed by a brief secondary resonance, like a relay finding its closed position and holding it. The click, and then a 2-second pause, and then the click again. Same profile, same interval. She stopped the mop mid-pass. She was not making a decision to stop. She was simply not continuing, which had a different quality. Her hand stayed on the handle. The mop head rested against the linoleum. The click came again. 2 seconds. Click. She did not look at the training room door. She was standing facing the water fountain, the mop at rest, and her attention had left her eyes almost entirely and relocated to her ears in the way that attention relocates when one sense needs all the available processing that the others were using. The building's ordinary sounds continued around the sound she was tracking. The clock ticked, the fountain dripped, the ventilation fan ran its cycle, the building breathed. The click came again, and the interval was shorter this time, not by much, a fraction of a second perhaps, but shorter. She stayed still for 30 seconds, or perhaps 40. She was not counting. The counting was happening somewhere below conscious direction, the part of her that tracked intervals the way the ear tracked the phase relationship between the clock and the drip. The click again. Shorter interval still. She set the mop against the wall. She had set it in this position in this corridor many times, braced at the angle that held it, handle tilted so the mop head rested against the wall's baseboard, and the pole angled outward enough that gravity kept it in position rather than sliding it down. She positioned it with the automatic care of a person who had set things down in particular ways in particular positions for so long that the setting down was indistinguishable from the working. She walked to the training room door. The corridor behind her was ordinary in every detail. The overhead fluorescents ran their even white from one end to the other. The linoleum held the light. The clock above the water fountain moved its second hand in its discrete ticks. The water fountain dripped its 8-second interval. At the east end, the supply office door was closed. At the west end, the main entrance junction was empty. Through the training room door's narrow, reinforced window, she could see the front third of the room. The demonstration table, and on it the inert training models Obina had arranged for the session, small cylindrical and rectangular units in their standard configurations, spaced for display. Among them, one unit sat at a slightly different angle than the others. Its access panel at its base was closed. Thibodeau was moving away from the demonstration table, toward his seat in the second row, and there was a deliberateness in his movement away from the table, a purposeful not looking back that she registered from this distance without difficulty. She put her hand on the lever handle. The click came through the door. The interval was shorter again, 1.5 seconds, perhaps less. She stood at the door with her hand on the handle, and the corridor behind her as ordinary as any morning she had worked in it. The mop leaned against the wall at the angle it always leaned when she had set it down and was coming back. The clock ticked. The fountain dripped. Outside, through the high windows, the morning light had moved from its low, early angle to something fuller and more direct, laying broad rectangles across the linoleum rather than the thin, early bands. The light was unremarkable. The corridor was unremarkable. The building sounded like any other Thursday in the season. She stayed at the door and listened to the things she alone in the building could name, while the interval between the clicks shortened and shortened again, and the morning continued being ordinary all around her. The interval had dropped to 1.3 seconds when the alarm activated. It came from the ceiling speakers in the corridor and the room simultaneously. The two-tone lockdown signal that every person who worked or trained at Halcourt Military Academy heard twice a year in drills and had not, in this academic year, heard outside of one. A lower tone and a higher tone in sequence, clean and authoritative, with a half-second gap between each pair and a 1-second gap between each repetition. It had a different profile from the fire evacuation signal and a different profile from the general emergency tone. The lockdown signal was lower in overall volume than either, designed to be heard and registered without creating the kind of acoustic environment that prevented the thinking necessary to respond to a lockdown. It announced itself without escalating the room. Ruth felt the magnetic lock engage before she heard it. The lever handle under her right palm communicated it as a sensation before her ears processed the sound. A deep mechanical pull transmitted through the door's hardware, the electromagnetic coil reaching full draw, and the latch seating in the strike plate with a resistance that changed the quality of the handle from a tool she could use to an object she was resting her hand against. The change happened in under a quarter second. Her hand registered it in the first fraction of that. She moved her hand off the handle. Inside the training room, through the wire mesh glass of the narrow window, the room reorganized in the first 4 seconds of the alarm. Cadets stood, chairs moved. 2 people spoke at the same time. The alarm had caught Obina in the middle of her route back from the supply office, and Ruth saw her come through the door from the internal side 2 seconds after the lock had engaged, stepping into the corridor briefly before the door's auto pull brought it back into the lock position. The lock seated again. Obina was inside. Ruth could see her through the narrow window, facing the room, radio coming up in her right hand, her face doing what faces do in the first 10 seconds of an unexpected emergency. A rapid sequence of assessments, each updating the one before. Alarm to room to demonstration table to device to room again. The relay click was still cycling. The corridor alarm was covering it now, but Ruth had moved close enough to the door to feel it as much as hear it. A vibration transmitted through the door's lower panel each time the relay seated. A faint percussive transfer from the room's air into the door's material, and from the door's material into the floor. She could feel it through the soles of her work shoes if she stood close enough and let herself be still. The interval was at 1 second now. Not much time between 1.3 and 1. The decrease was not linear. She knew that. She put 3 knocks on the door with the heel of her right hand. Not loud, not frantic. A sound calibrated to cut through the alarm noise and land as a deliberate communication rather than the result of someone pounding on a surface because they did not know what else to do. 3 raps with consistent spacing between them. Obina turned to the door. She had her radio in one hand and was speaking into it. Ruth could see her lips moving and read enough of the shape to get the content. Disposal team, training room wing, building C, the standard call. Obina's eyes came to Ruth through the narrow window and her expression changed, the way expressions change when a second thing requiring processing arrives before the first thing has been processed. Ruth pointed at the device on the demonstration table. Then she pointed at herself. Then at the door handle. She kept her face neutral, which was not difficult. The proposal was clear or it was not, and elaborating it would not make it clearer. Either Obina understood what was being offered and made a decision about it, or she did not and would make a different decision. Both were her decisions to make. Ruth stood at the door and waited. What Obina's face did during the next 4 seconds was complicated. Ruth watched it without attempting to interpret specific components. What she identified was the underlying structure, a person confronting 2 facts that required simultaneous processing, one of which was that the disposal team was 7 minutes away according to the radio call, and the relay interval was now at something under 1 second. And the other of which was that the person at the door was a custodial worker in gray work clothes and thin work gloves. The first fact was a time problem with a fixed endpoint. The second was a social fact about category and credibility, the kind of fact that normally operated without conscious examination because it rarely needed to be examined at all. 4 seconds. Obina went to the interior override panel on the wall beside the door frame. She entered the manual release code. The lock disengaged with the same deep mechanical pull in reverse, the coil releasing, and Ruth pressed the lever handle down and pushed the door open. The room arrived at once. The alarm sound, louder inside than the corridor without the door absorbing it. The smell of close air and bodies, the cleaning solution from the morning's floor maintenance mixing now with a particular smell of adrenaline in an enclosed space, which was not metaphor but chemistry, a sharpness, slightly metallic, at the back of the throat. The heat from 8 people and the overhead lights in a room 40 feet by 25 with the ventilation at its daytime setting, which was adequate for ordinary occupation but not for 8 people managing acute stress. The fluorescent ceiling fixtures in the training room were an older installation than the corridors, and they produced a slightly warmer light with a cycling pulse at a frequency below conscious perception that the eye felt as mild fatigue. 3 cadets were against the left wall. 2 were near their seats in the middle rows, standing but not having moved far from where they'd been when the alarm started. Obina was at the interior override panel to Ruth's immediate left. To her right, near the door's interior wall, was Nuofor, standing with his arms at his sides rather than crossed, which was different from how he had stood in the corridor. Thibodeau was against the far right wall, one hand braced on the wall surface beside him, his weight distributed in the particular way of someone who is not sure whether the situation requires moving toward something or away from it, and has chosen for now to remain in contact with a fixed surface. On the demonstration table, 8 feet from the door and centered in the room's forward space, the inert training models were arranged in the order Obina had set them for the session. 4 cylindrical units in a staggered row at the table's back, 2 rectangular units at the front left, and at the front right, set at a slightly different angle from the others, the mislabeled unit. Its access panel was at its base, facing the room, and the panel was closed. Along its right side, at intervals of roughly 2 inches, 3 indicator positions had activated. Small translucent windows in the casing that in a true inert unit would contain no active components behind them, but in this unit contained a sequencing circuit that was now in its arming progression. The first 2 windows showed a steady amber. The third was cycling between amber and a darker color at the relay interval Ruth had been tracking from the corridor. She did not look at the room. She looked at the device. She was already calculating the approach angle to the table before she had cleared the first row of seats. A cadet she did not know by name, Mansouri, was in the aisle between the first and second rows, and he moved into her path as she came through it. Not aggressively. He was moving toward the door at the same time she was moving into the room, and he arrived in the aisle at the same moment she did, and he registered her presence and her direction, and his face said something about what he thought was happening, which was that an elderly woman in work clothes had come into the room in the middle of a lockdown and appeared to be moving toward the live device on the demonstration table. His hand came up toward her arm. She walked past him, not through him, not with a gesture or a word, simply along a trajectory that took her beside him rather than into him. A slight adjustment made without slowing, and the hand that had been moving toward her arm closed on air because she had already moved past where the arm was. "Hey, Mansouri," said behind her. She was at the demonstration table. The table's surface was the standard academy training configuration, a pale gray laminate with a raised lip around its perimeter to prevent equipment rolling off. and the surface held the arrangement Obina had set. Ruth put her left hand on the table's edge and looked at the device for the first time from a distance she could use. It was an SI-7 live simulator, a training cycle device built for controlled detonation exercises in the late 1990s by a manufacturer that had since been absorbed twice and no longer produced this line. The SI-7 was a closed-cycle arming system, which meant that once its arming sequence was activated, it could not be interrupted by removing a power source, because the sequence ran off an internal capacitor that had been charged by the activation event itself. The arming sequence took the device from a neutral state to a fully armed state in a graduated progression across 12 relay positions, each position taking a fixed interval shorter than the one before it, the intervals decreasing on a geometric rather than linear scale. The first position took 60 seconds. The 12th took under 2 seconds. Once the 12th position seated, the device entered a terminal sequence that ran a final 8 count and triggered the simulator's output function, which in a controlled exercise was a loud percussive report and a contained pressure pulse sufficient to confirm that the device had functioned. In a controlled exercise, the room was cleared and the device was operated behind shielding. This room was not cleared. The shielding was in a storage cabinet 3 buildings away. She was looking at the third indicator window, the cycling one. The interval between amber and the darker color was now at under 1 second. She was at the 4th relay position, possibly moving to the 5th. From the 4th position, on a geometric scale, she had 4 minutes or less, decreasing sharply. From the 5th position, she had under 2 minutes. She needed to know which position she was at. She pulled the gloves off. The left one first, then worked the right one over the 3-fingered hand, the way you remove something you have set down 10,000 times and know the exact sequence to make the removal take the minimum number of motions. She set both gloves together on the table's raised edge. Someone in the room made a sound. She registered it as a sound and not as a communication that required response. She needed 2 things. She turned and looked at Obina's supply kit, open on the instructor's desk against the left wall. The same desk she had noted when Obina had been setting up earlier through the training room door's window. The kit was a rectangular carrying case, blue, open-topped, with divided internal sections. In the kit's right section, angled upright, was a folding inspection mirror on a telescoping handle. Standard equipment for this type of demonstration session because the inert units had internal configurations that instructors used the mirror to display to cadets during instruction. She saw it from across the room. She crossed to the desk. She took the mirror. She looked at the desk's surface. Obina used the desk for administration during sessions. A course binder, 2 pens, a ceramic cup holding writing implements, and a handful of small office supplies. Among the office supplies was a clip tray with a magnet base holding 6 silver paper clips. She took 1 paper clip. She went back to the demonstration table. "Ma'am," this was Obina from behind her voice carrying a register that was not quite a command and not quite a question. Ruth heard in it the thing Obina was working to reconcile, which was that she had opened the door and she needed to not have made a mistake in opening the door. "The disposal team is 6 minutes out. Tell them to hold in the corridor," Ruth said, "outside the door." A beat. "Why?" Obina said. "Because if they come in before I'm done, they'll make noise and I need quiet." She said it in the same voice she used for everything, level, unhurried, pitched at the volume appropriate to the room without the alarm, which meant slightly too quiet for the room with the alarm. Obina would have to have been paying close attention to catch all of it. Ruth did not check whether she had. She was already working. She extended the mirror on its telescoping handle to its full length, which was 14 inches from the folded pivot point to the mirror face. She angled the mirror face using the pivot adjustment, a thumb wheel on the handle shaft, until the angle showed her the device's underside, where its base sat flush with the table surface. Between the device's base and the table, there was a gap of roughly 4 millimeters from the mounting feet, enough to admit the mirror's face at the correct angle. She slid the mirror under the device's base with her left hand. In the mirror, she could see the base panel's interior surface, visible through the gap, and on it, the secondary relay assembly. The SI7 secondary assembly was accessible through the base panel's removable section, which was held by 2 quarter-turn fasteners on its face. The panel Thibodeau had opened was the access panel on the device's side, the one with the setting adjustment Thibodeau had misidentified and triggered. That panel was now closed, but the activation had already processed. The access point she needed was the base panel. She needed to confirm which relay position the device was at before she opened the base panel. Opening the base panel on an SI7 in the wrong relay position would interrupt the magnetic field maintaining the primary latch in the closed position, which would complete the arming sequence from wherever it currently sat directly to the terminal count. If she opened it in the right position, between relay positions 4 and 7 on the SI7 sequence, the interruption would be within the mechanical tolerance window the device's designers had built into the assembly for authorized field access during controlled exercises. Within that window, the arming sequence could be stopped. She needed to see the relay indicator drum. It was inside the base panel, mounted to the assembly housing, and it showed the current position as a number on a rotating drum face, visible through a small inspection port in the base panel's interior surface, designed to be read with a mirror and a flashlight during exercise maintenance. She had neither, but the light from the training room's overhead fluorescence was sufficient if she held the mirror at the right angle. She adjusted the mirror. In the mirror's face, she could see the number drum through the inspection port. It read 5. She was at position 5. She had a window. It was not a large window. The progression from 5 to 6 on a geometric scale from the SI7's original calibration ran approximately 90 seconds. After 6, the window closed. After 8, the question was no longer about the window. She needed to open the base panel at position 5 without disturbing the secondary relay's magnetic field, and without moving the device from the table surface, because the SI7's position sensitivity increased through the arming sequence, and at position 5, a significant tilt or impact could be read by the device's inertial contact as a completion event. She straightened the paperclip with both hands, running it between her thumb and the base of the index finger of her right hand, working it until it was straight to within 2 millimeters. Then she bent one end at a 90-degree angle, measuring the bend length against the last visible segment of the middle finger's first joint on her right hand, approximately 8 millimeters. She bent the angle again at the end of that measurement, a second 90-degree turn in the opposite direction, giving the end of the paperclip a small Z shape. The base panel's quarter-turn fasteners were Phillips head recesses in a standard size that the paperclip's bent end would not fit. She had not expected them to be. What she needed the paperclip for was the secondary relay catch, which was accessible not through the fasteners, but through the ventilation slot on the base panel's left side, a horizontal slot 3 millimeters tall and 20 millimeters wide, designed to allow air circulation to the relay assembly during operation. The slot was at the edge of the panel facing her. Inside it, at a depth of approximately 12 millimeters from the panel surface, was the catch, a spring-loaded arm that held the primary relay in its current position by mechanical contact, and that could be depressed inward by a thin implement inserted through the ventilation slot without requiring the panel to be opened first, which meant the magnetic field was not disrupted. Depressing the catch while the relay was at position 5 would interrupt the geometric progression and hold the relay at 5. The relay would not advance to 6. The arming sequence would be paused. Not disarmed, paused. The capacitor would still be charged, and the circuit would still be live, but the progression would require a manual re-advance to continue, and the terminal sequence could not initiate from a held position. After the sequence was held, the base panel could be opened and the capacitor discharged by shorting the discharge leads, which were at accessible positions in the base assembly, with a conductive object. The discharge would complete the de-arming. She brought the mirror up to view the ventilation slot from the correct angle and confirmed the catch's position inside it. Then she brought the paper clips bent in to the slot entrance. This was where the missing fingers mattered. Not in the way that the cadet in the corridor had meant when he made his comment, which was as a deficiency, a reduction of capability below a standard. The missing fingers mattered in the specific technical sense that the right hand's 2 absent fingers were the ring and small fingers, which were the fingers that would ordinarily have provided stability and counterpressure during close, fine work with a small implement at a fixed depth inside a narrow slot. Without them, the grip on the paperclip was a 3-point grip: thumb, index, and middle. 3-point grips were stable under static load but more susceptible to lateral deviation during dynamic insertion, because the counterpressure that the missing fingers would have provided against the ulnar side of the hand was absent. She compensated by changing the insertion angle. Instead of inserting the paperclip parallel to the slot's long axis, she angled it 15 degrees off parallel to the left, which moved the lateral force generated by the insertion into a vector that her 3 remaining fingers could manage without deviation. She had found this angle through repetition in contexts she did not think about in this room. The angle was in her hand rather than in her head. She inserted the bent end of the paperclip into the slot. At 12 millimeters depth, she felt the catch. The bent end of the Z contacted the catch arm surface, confirming position. She held the paperclip still for 2 seconds, checking that the contact was surface to surface and not edge to surface, which would have been insufficient. Then she began the depression. The catch moved inward on its spring with a resistance that was measurable and consistent, increasing from light to moderate over the first 5 millimeters of travel, and then releasing to a noticeably lighter resistance as the catch cleared the relay arm's engagement surface. She felt the release as a change in resistance transmitted from the catch through the paperclip to her thumb and index finger. She stopped depressing at the point of release and held there. Catch depressed, relay arm free of engagement, primary relay held mechanically at position 5. The relay click stopped. The room was not silent. The alarm was still cycling. People were breathing. Someone near the back of the room was breathing audibly, the short chest breath of someone managing acute fear. The fluorescent fixtures were doing their imperceptible cycling. The ventilation fan ran. But the specific clicking sound she had been tracking since the corridor was gone, replaced by its absence, which had a different acoustic quality from silence. In the same way that the space where a sound was is not the same as a space where a sound never was. She held the paperclip at its current depth and pressure. The catch was depressed. The relay was held. She was aware, in a general and non-urgent way, that her right hand was trembling. It had started at some point during the insertion without her conscious registration of it beginning. The tremor was in the thenar muscles of the thumb, the group that controlled thumb opposition, and that on her right hand had been under continuous elevated tension since she had straightened the paperclip, which was approximately 4 minutes ago. The tremor was not large. It was at a frequency that was not visible to anyone observing the hand from a distance of more than 3 feet, but it was present in the contact between the bent paperclip end and the catch surface as a micro vibration that she could feel. If it increased, it would introduce lateral movement to the paperclip at the catch contact point, and the catch could slip off the edge of the relay arm rather than continuing to depress it. She did not move her hand. She did not adjust her grip. She let the tremor move through the contact point, and she held her position relative to the catch, and she monitored whether the micro vibration at the contact point was increasing or holding. It was holding. She continued to hold. To her left, approximately 4 feet, she was aware of Nuafor. She had not looked at him since she entered the room, but she had been aware of his position the entire time through peripheral attention. The same faculty that in the corridor had given her the moving map of the cadet group without requiring her to look at them directly. He was at the left end of the front row of seats, standing, and he had not moved since she came to the table. She was aware of this because a person standing still in a room of moving people produces a different peripheral quality than a person moving. His stillness was not the stillness of someone frozen. It was the stillness of someone whose full available attention was on one thing. She knew this quality also. From behind her, from the right side of the room, she heard Thibodeau's breathing before she heard him speak. His breathing had the character of someone who had been holding a large amount of internal movement in place for several minutes and was running low on the capacity to continue doing it. She should not be touching that. He said it to the room rather than to her, which was the same social orientation as the corridor comment had been, directed at everyone except the subject. Seriously, she's a custodian. Someone needs to stop her. Obina, you need to stop her. Obina did not respond. Ruth had not heard Obina move from her position near the instructor's desk since the radio call. She was somewhere behind and to the left. Her breathing was controlled. I'm just saying, Thibodeau again, his voice finding a note under the performing register. Something underneath it that was not the performing register at all, but was what the performing register had been covering. I'm saying that nobody knows if she knows what she's doing. We don't know anything about her. She came in and nobody stopped her, and she's touching a live device and we're just watching. Ruth did not respond. She was aware of the time that had passed since she depressed the catch. She did not have a watch. She was tracking elapsed time by the alarm's repetition cycle, which she had counted 7 full repetitions of since the catch depression. At the alarm's established interval, that was approximately 1 minute 40 seconds, she had perhaps 3 minutes and 40 seconds remaining in the comfortable part of the window. She had more than that before the window closed entirely, but the comfortable range was the range in which she preferred to complete the discharge, because after it, the capacitor's charge state became less predictable. She needed to open the base panel. The quarter-turn fasteners on the base panel were accessible from the panel face, which was the panel's front surface, which was the surface currently facing the table's top surface because the device was resting base down. She could not reach the fasteners without either tilting the device or creating access from underneath. She looked at the table's raised lip on the near side. The lip was 20 millimeters tall and ran the perimeter of the table surface. The device's base footprint was smaller than the distance from the table's edge to where the device was currently positioned, by approximately 6 inches. If she moved the device toward the near edge until the base panel overhung the lip, the panel face would be accessible from below the table surface without tilting the device. Moving the device along the table surface while maintaining the catch depression at the current depth and angle was a two-handed operation. Her left hand would have to support the device from above during the move, maintaining consistent downward pressure to keep the base feet on the table surface and prevent rocking, while her right hand maintained the paperclip's angle and depth. The simultaneous management of both tasks with the current three-point grip on the paperclip would require the lateral stability of her left arm to compensate for the rotational tendency of the device if it met any resistance during the slide. She brought her left hand to the top of the device. She rested her palm flat against its upper surface, fingers spread, distributing pressure evenly. She checked the contact, palm to surface, even pressure, no contact at the edges, which would have created lever points. Then she slid the device toward her, slowly, 3 inches per second, no more. The device's base feet were rubber, and they moved across the laminate surface with a low friction and a slight squeak that she registered and did not respond to. The paperclip's bent end maintained its contact with the catch through the move because she was moving the device and the catch together, keeping their relative positions fixed while the absolute position changed. This was the correct approach. She had known it before she started the move. The device reached the table's near edge. The base panel's face overhung the lip by 2 inches on her side. She stopped. She called to the room without turning her head from the device. "I need someone to reach under the table from the right side and turn 2 fasteners counterclockwise 90 degrees each. The fasteners are at the 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock positions on the base panel face. Quarter turn only. Stop when you feel them release." Silence. "Then where?" Obina said. "Under the right side of the table. The panel is overhanging the edge on my side. You'll see it. 2 Phillips recesses, counterclockwise, quarter turn." Obina's footsteps crossed the room. Ruth heard her go to the table's right side. A pause while she oriented under the table. "I see them," Obina said. "Counterclockwise, 90 degrees. Stop at release." A sound of contact with the first fastener, a short rotation, a click, the fastener releasing from the quarter turn locking position. Then the same with the second fastener, a short rotation, a click. "Done," Obina said. "Step back from the table." Obina's footsteps retreated. The base panel was no longer fastener secured. Its weight held it against the base, and the device's position at the table edge meant the panel faced down and outward. Ruth reached her left hand under the table's edge and found the panel's free corner. She applied a slight outward pressure, slow and consistent, and the panel moved on its hinge, swinging down and outward until it reached a right angle to the device's base and stopped on its hinge limit. The base assembly was now accessible. She could not see it directly. She adjusted the inspection mirror in her left hand, repositioning it under the table to angle the mirror face upward toward the open panel. The overhead light was not ideal for this angle, but it was sufficient. She could see the relay assembly's housing, the indicator drum showing position 5, and the discharge leads. The discharge leads were 2 contact posts at the left side of the housing, color-coded in the standard configuration, red and black. Each post approximately 3 millimeters in diameter and extending 4 millimeters from the housing surface. Shorting them with a conductive object would complete the discharge cycle and render the device inert. The object needed to make simultaneous contact with both posts and hold that contact for approximately 3 seconds, which was the discharge cycle duration for a capacitor of this size and charge state. She had nothing metal within reach except the paperclip currently inserted in the ventilation slot. She needed to maintain the catch depression while also making contact with the discharge leads, which was a 2-point problem. One implement for the catch, a different implement for the leads. She had one implement. She looked at the table surface above her. On it, the inert training models, Obina's mirror case, the ceramic cup from the instructor's desk that she had not moved. The ceramic cup. Ceramic was not conductive, but the cup held writing implements and a handful of small office supplies. And among the office supplies, she had noted a second paperclip tray earlier, a flat rectangular magnet with 3 paperclips attached. She addressed the room. "Someone bring me the paperclip tray from the instructor's cup. Set it on the table edge. Do not touch the device." A pause. Footsteps, a presence on her right side close to the table, and the small sound of the magnet tray being placed on the table edge 3 inches from where her right hand was working. She took a paperclip from the tray without looking at it. She straightened it with her left hand, one-handed, running it against her left thumb the way you would roll a thin stick against a flat surface. 4 passes, working the wire straight enough to serve as a contact bridge. She had 2 paperclips. She had 2 tasks. And she had approximately 2 minutes and 20 seconds in the comfortable window. She moved the bent paperclip in her right hand from active depression to what she needed it to do next, which required a change in grip, but not a change in depth. She kept the bent end against the catch surface, but shifted her thumb to a brace position rather than a depression position, maintaining mechanical contact with the catch arm without active force, which allowed the catch to stay in its current position through mechanical contact alone, rather than active pressure. The catch arm was still depressed. The relay was still held. She brought the second paperclip down through the open base panel toward the discharge leads, feeding it through the gap between the panel hinge and the housing surface with her left hand. The straightened paperclip was long enough to span the distance between the 2 posts. She bridged them. Contact with the first post. Right side of the straightened wire, pressing against the red contact surface. Contact with the second post. Left side of the straightened wire, pressing against the black. She held them both in simultaneous contact with consistent pressure, and the discharge began. There was no sound from the discharge. The capacitor gave up its charge into the paperclip bridge without announcement. What she felt was a change in the resistance at the discharge leads. A brief warmth in the wire transmitted to her fingers, lasting less than a second, and then the resistance dropping. She held the bridge for 3 seconds past the warmth, then 4. She removed the second paperclip. She removed the first paperclip from the ventilation slot, slowly, maintaining the angle of insertion until the bent end was clear of the catch surface. The catch was released. The relay, at position 5, was now without power. The indicator drum would not advance. She straightened up. The room was in a particular kind of stillness that rooms arrive at when the thing that had been generating urgency is gone, and the people in the room have not yet reorganized around what comes next. The alarm was still running. Nobody had turned it off. Ruth was aware of this the same way she was aware of everything else in the room, as a fact about the current conditions. The third indicator window on the device's right side had gone dark. The second indicator was still amber, a steady amber, because the sequence had been held at position 5 and the circuit was now discharged. It would not advance from that amber. She set both paper clips on the table surface and picked up her gloves from the table edge. She pulled on the left one first, then worked the right one over the 3-fingered hand, fitting the glove material to the remaining fingers and settling the gloves back against the hand's dorsal surface, then settling the wrist elastic over the wrist. The motion took the same time it always took. She had not altered it. She turned toward the door. The room rearranged in her peripheral vision as she turned. Obina, near the instructor's desk, her radio held in both hands, her face holding the complex state of a person who had just watched something happen that she had not been certain was going to turn out the way it had turned out. Lay and Ferreira against the left wall, standing differently than they had been standing when Ruth entered, a slackening in the posture that corresponded to the removal of what the posture had been bracing against. Mansouri near the second row, Reyes still holding the coffee cup, which he had apparently held through the entire event without setting it down. Nuafor at the left end of the front row, standing exactly where he had been standing since she entered, still in the particular stillness of someone whose attention had not been divided. Thibodeau was against the right wall, his bracing hand no longer on the wall surface, but hanging at his side, and he was looking at the space where Ruth had been working, rather than at Ruth herself. She moved toward the door. She was 4 steps from it when the corridor outside changed. She saw it through the narrow window before she heard it, the quality of light in the corridor shifting as multiple bodies moved into it. The overhead fluorescent columns in the glass interrupted and restored in quick succession. And then the sound arriving, heavy shoes on linoleum at a pace between a fast walk and a run. Multiple sets, the rustle and equipment contact sounds of people moving in gear. The shadow of the first person fell across the window, and the corridor outside the door was suddenly full. The door was tried from outside. The magnetic lock held it. Through the window, the foreground figure resolved, a man she had not seen in this building before, tall, in the Academy's administrative dress uniform, silver at his temples, the specific posture of someone who had long ago internalized physical authority and no longer had to enact it consciously. Behind him, 2 armed security staff, and behind them 2 more figures. The disposal team, identifiable by the carry case one of them was holding. He looked through the narrow window. The man she did not know saw the room. His eyes moved from the cadets against the wall, to Obina, to the device on the table, to Ruth, in the same sequence that all eyes moved when they first took in the room. But his sequence paused on the device and then moved to Ruth and stayed there for a moment longer than the sequence required. He tried the handle again. The magnetic lock was still engaged. The building's lockdown system had not yet been manually overridden. The security officer beside him had a hand on her radio and was moving toward it. The colonel put his left hand out, a small lateral motion, palm facing down, fingers together. The officer stopped. His hand stayed out for a moment, the same gesture it had been, and then he lowered it. He stood at the door with both hands now at his sides, and he looked through the narrow window at the room, and then at Ruth specifically. And then he simply waited. He was in the building's corridor, on the other side of a locked door, and the situation inside the room was what it was, and he was waiting to see what it became. Through the window, at this distance, in this light, she could read his face the way she had always been able to read faces at distance. What was on it was not the thing she expected. It was not the face of a building commandant confronting an unauthorized civilian who had entered a lockdown zone. It was something closer to recognition, the specific quality of seeing something you have encountered before in a form you did not anticipate finding it in again. She did not know him. She thought, looking at his face through the glass, that he might know something about her, or about a record somewhere, or about the designation she had not been called by in the better part of a decade. She arrived at this conclusion the way she arrived at most conclusions, from the evidence available, assessed without embellishment. She looked away from the window and looked at Obina. "Release the lockdown from the interior panel," she said. "The device is safe." Obina moved to the interior panel. The lockdown signal stopped as she entered the release code, the building's alarm cutting off mid-cycle with the abruptness of a sound that has been present long enough to become ambient and whose absence is more noticeable than its presence had been. In the sudden quiet of the training room in the corridor, the clock above the water fountain was audible through the door's remaining gap, and the water fountain's 8-second drip, and the ventilation fan, and nothing else. The door opened. He came through it with the controlled entry of someone who has spent time in environments where entering a space efficiently and with minimum disruption to the space's current conditions is a practiced skill. His eyes went once more through the room in the quick survey that he would not have had to consciously decide to do. And then they came to the demonstration table, and then to Ruth. The security staff remained at the threshold. The disposal team stopped in the corridor behind them. The door was open, but only the colonel had come through it. Ruth was standing 3 steps from the door, which was where she had been when she turned back to Obina. She had not moved toward the door or away from it. He looked at her. He looked at the device on the table, noting the open base panel hanging on its hinge, the 2 paper clips on the table surface, the mirror beside them. He looked at her hands, at the gloves over the 3-fingered right hand. He looked at her face. The room was waiting. She could feel the room waiting without looking at it. He said 2 words, her given name and then her full rank designation. The complete designation including the grade and the service identifier, the way it appeared in a record rather than the way it appeared in informal address. He said it quietly, in the register of a man in an ordinary room, saying something that was accurate. Ruth stopped walking. She did not turn around immediately. She stood facing the door, 3 steps from it, with her hand near the lever handle and the corridor outside visible through the narrow window. The mop was out there, against the wall at the angle she had left it, handle tilted, head resting against the baseboard. The corridor's fluorescent columns ran their full length. The clock ticked above the water fountain. She stood still for the length of 1 breath, and then she turned around. What you just heard takes something specific to build, and this story still has 1 part left. If you want to know what she says when she turns, stay here. Part 3 goes up in 1 piece. She turned around on the heel of her left foot, a single pivot, and faced the room. DeGrage was standing 7 feet inside the door with his hands at his sides and his weight distributed in the way of someone who had decided to be exactly where he was and saw no reason to be elsewhere. The security staff were at the threshold behind him, occupying the door frame without coming through it. Through the narrow window above their shoulders, the corridor was visible. And in the corridor, the disposal team stood with their carry case and waited. The mop was visible at the left edge of the window, its handle tilted at its angle against the wall's baseboard, the same angle as when she had set it down. DeGrange looked at her. Ruth looked at him. She had not known him when she saw his face through the narrow window during the work. She knew him now. In the way you know a person's function and rank and approximate history from the evidence of how they occupied a room. He was the commandant of this building and had been for some years. The silver at his temples and the settled quality of his authority said that, and he was a man who had come personally to his building's lockdown rather than managing it by radio, which said something else. He was in his mid-50s, upright without effort, with hands that had the particular condition of hands that had spent extended time outdoors in varied climates. He was looking at her with the expression of someone who had seen what he had seen through the window and was arriving at the end of a process of connecting information. She waited. He did not repeat the 2 words he had said to her back. He said nothing yet, which was the right decision. And the fact that it was the right decision and he knew it told her something additional about him. He let the space between his 2 words and whatever came next be what it needed to be, which was a space that required nothing from either of them until they were both ready to proceed out of it. The room around them was doing what rooms do immediately after the thing that had been generating acute stress is removed, readjusting. The bodies that had been held in elevated states for the duration of the lockdown were producing the particular biological sequence that follows the removal of a sustained threat, which manifested in the room as small involuntary movements, posture releasing from fixed positions, breathing changing register, the stored physical expression of the preceding minutes coming out in the forms available to it. Leigh had put both hands over her face briefly and then lowered them. Ferreira was looking at the floor. Reyes had finally set the coffee cup down on the seat of the nearest chair. Mansouri was sitting, which he had not been when Ruth entered the room, and he was sitting in the particular way of someone whose legs had delivered him to a chair, because the legs understood the situation before the rest of him caught up. Thibodeau had not moved from the right wall. His hand was back on the wall surface beside him, not bracing now, but resting, and he was looking at the demonstration table, at the device on it and the open base panel, and the 2 paper clips on the laminate surface, and the mirror. He was looking at these things with the specific attention of someone who is looking at the consequences of something they did, taking inventory of what the thing they did actually meant. The gap between what they had imagined the thing would be and what it turned out to be. His face was not performing anything. There was no register available to perform. What was on his face was what was on his face, unmediated. Nufor had moved. He was no longer at the left end of the front row. He had moved at some point during the last several minutes to the center of the room's forward area, and he was standing there in no particular relationship to the furniture, just standing in the open space, and he was looking at Ruth. She registered all of this in the way she registered the corridor's conditions every morning, in a continuous sweep without pausing on any element longer than the element required. Desgrange spoke. He spoke to the room, not to her specifically, but he had not looked away from her when he began. "Lieutenant Obina," he said. His voice had the quality of a voice that had been used to address rooms for a long time, pitched to land at every point in the space without requiring effort, the kind of volume that communicated control without loudness. "Pull the training room security footage. This session from the beginning. Display it." Obina moved to the instructor's desk. The training room had a fixed camera mount at the upper left corner, a standard academy installation for session review and assessment, and its feed ran through the building's central system. She brought it up on the display screen on the room's front wall, the screen Obina used for demonstration material during instruction. The footage came up with a timestamp in the upper right corner, 8:22:17. It showed the room from the upper left angle, which gave a view of the demonstration table's full surface, the seats in the forward 2 rows, and the door. The cadets were visible at their seats. Obina was visible at the front of the room. The training crate was visible on the table, open, the equipment arranged. Obina advanced the feed to the point where she had left the room for the supply office, time-stamped 8:33:44. The room reorganized around Obina's departure, the way it always reorganized around a departure. The ambient energy changing register, voices rising slightly. On the screen, Thibodeau was in the second row to the right of center. He was visible standing at 8:34:21, 2 minutes and 37 seconds after Obina left the room. He moved to the demonstration table. The footage was clear enough to see his hands on the device. The access panel on the side of the unit. His fingers on the latch. The panel opening. His hand inside the panel. The adjustment. The expression on his face during it, which was the expression of someone doing something in front of other people that they are not certain they should be doing. The small performance of confidence held over the slightly larger uncertainty underneath it. The panel closing, his hands pulling back, and then him moving to his seat. The deliberate movement away from the table, the not looking back that she had read from the corridor through the window, visible now as a complete action on the screen. The room watched itself. Desgrange watched it without reaction in his face or his posture. He watched it the way he would watch any piece of surveillance footage relevant to an incident under review, which was to say he watched it as evidence. When the footage reached the point of the alarm's activation, he put his hand up, a short, contained gesture toward the screen. "Stop it there," he said. The image froze. Thibodeau's face on the screen, caught in the moment of looking up at the alarm's sound, was not the performing face. It was the face underneath the performing face. Desgrange looked at Thibodeau. Thibodeau, on the right wall, looked back at him. "Step forward," Desgrange said. Thibodeau came off the wall and stood in the center right section of the room. "You opened that access panel," Desgrange said. Not a question. Thibodeau's mouth opened, and the words he had were the words available to someone who had been watching the footage of themselves doing the thing they had done and knew that the words available to them were not adequate. What came out was, "I was trying to see how it worked." Desgrange did not respond to that immediately. He let it stand in the room for a moment, not as a cruelty, but because some statements need to exist in silence briefly before the person who said them understands what they actually said. "You are suspended from this program pending a full review board," he said. "You will report to the administrative office in 1 hour and remain in the facility until the review board is convened. Is that understood?" Thibodeau said, "Yes, sir." The "sir" came out automatically, from training, from the part of him that produced the correct response before the rest of him had processed what was being said. Desgrange moved his attention to the room. The incident in the corridor prior to the session. He said this without preamble or contextualizing sentence. "The building's corridor cameras cover the wing. I have reviewed the corridor footage from this morning." He had reviewed it on his way here, Ruth concluded. Someone had pulled both feeds simultaneously when the lockdown notification went through the building's command structure. He had seen the corridor before he arrived. He had seen the glove, and the comment, and the bucket. He had seen Thibodeau's boot. He had seen Nuofor not following and then following. He had arrived at this room already in possession of what the morning had contained. "Ferreira," he said. Ferreira came off the left wall and stood. "Brzezinski," he said. Brzezinski stood from the second row. He looked at the two of them. "Suspended pending review. Same as Thibodeau. You will report to the administrative office within the hour." He paused. "This review will address conduct unbecoming of cadets of this academy, and it will run concurrently with the review of the safety incident. The two matters are separate. Each will receive separate findings. That will be all." The three of them moved to the door. Thibodeau passed the demonstration table on his way and did not look at the device on it. He looked at the paper clips. Then he went through the door and into the corridor, and the security officer outside turned to accompany them to the administrative office, and the door closed. The room had 5 cadets in it now instead of 8. Nufor, Oyalaran, Mansuri, Lay, and Reyes. Obina was at the instructor's desk. DeGrange was in the room's forward area, and he turned now from the door and addressed the 5 remaining cadets. "You are dismissed from this session," he said. "The session will be rescheduled. You are not to discuss the details of this incident with anyone outside this room until you are interviewed as part of the review process. Those interviews will be scheduled today. That is all." They collected their things, which was a brief process because the session had not progressed far enough for the things to have been distributed. Nufor had his ID card and nothing else out. Lay had a stylus, which she capped and pocketed. The 5 of them moved to the door in the specific close group of people who are leaving a space together because the space has been dismissed rather than because they have agreed to leave together. The door opened. They went through it. The room had DeGrange in it, and Obina, and Ruth, and the disposal team waiting in the corridor, and the device on the table with its base panel still open. "Lieutenant," DeGrange said to Obina, "brief the team in the corridor. Have them complete the device inspection and transport. Get me a written incident summary by end of day." "Yes, sir," Obina said. She picked up her supply kit from the desk and moved to the door. She stopped at the door and looked at Ruth. The look lasted 3 seconds and contained more than 3 seconds of content, but she did not try to fit it into words, and Ruth did not require her to. Obina went through the door. The disposal team came through after her, 2 of them, moving to the demonstration table with the practiced efficiency of people whose work was to manage exactly this kind of situation, and who found the open base panel and the paperclip implements informative without finding them remarkable. The room was quiet. Desgrange looked at Ruth. "I want to tell the cadets who you are," he said. It was not phrased as a request or a statement of intent. It was phrased as a statement of what was true for him, which left the shape of a response open rather than closing it. Ruth looked at the disposal team, who were working the base panel with the correct tools from the carry case, not rushing, taking their methodical inventory of what had been done and confirming the device's current state. She looked at the table surface, the 2 paper clips, the inspection mirror. "All right," she said. DeGrange went to the door and opened it. The corridor was not empty. The remaining 5 cadets were in it, not having gone far, occupying the corridor with the energy of people who do not know whether to leave or stay and have resolved this by staying close. The security officer who had not gone with the others was at the stairwell end. The corridor's fluorescent light ran its even white. DeGrange held the door. He looked at the 5 cadets in the corridor. "Back in the room," he said, not loudly. They came back through the door. He let it close. He stood in the front of the room, in the position from which the instructor normally addressed the group, the position between the demonstration table and the first row. The 5 cadets had not sat. They were standing in the forward area of the room in an arrangement that was not quite a formation and not quite informal. The arrangement of people who have been recalled without being given instructions about how to stand. Ruth was at the left side of the room, near the wall. She had not moved to a particular position. She was where she had been when Obina left. DeGrange said, "The woman who disarmed the device is Ruth Keller." He said the name the way he had said it from across the room, in the accurate register, as information that was factually correct and relevant to what was being addressed. He did not say it as an announcement. Her designation at time of discharge was Master Sergeant, Explosive Ordnance Disposal, with the grade and service identifier of her classification. He said the full designation, correctly, and without looking at anything that would have been a source for it, which meant it was in his memory rather than on any card or screen in the room. He had known this when he came through the door. He looked at the 5 cadets. She completed 22 years of active EOD service. Her confirmed disposal record at time of discharge numbered in a range that places her in the top tier of rated EOD specialists in the service's history. I will not give you the specific number because that specific number is not what I want you to take from this room. He paused. What I want you to take from this room is that the confirmed disposal record exists and that you sat your safety exam 3 rows behind the person who holds it. The room received this without sound. Her rank insignia, at the time she was photographed for the service portrait that exists in the archives of the EOD Training Center, showed 4 confirmed awards for exceptional performance under conditions constituting immediate risk to the specialist's life. He said this the way the preceding information had been said, in the factual register, without the ornamentation that would have made it a different kind of speech. The missing fingers on her right hand are the result of a pressure-triggered device that activated during a field disarm procedure approximately 11 years ago. The convoy she was protecting at the time of the activation comprised 14 personnel. They were not in the casualty report from that deployment. She was. Nobody moved. DeGrange did not look at Ruth while he said this. He was looking at the 5 cadets, delivering what he had said the way he would deliver any briefing where the facts were the point, and the delivery of the facts was the thing that had to be done correctly and without embellishment. The conduct in the corridor this morning toward Master Sergeant Keller has been reviewed, he said. 3 cadets have been suspended pending formal review. Those review findings will address the conduct and its implications for continued enrollment in this program. He stopped for a moment. His eyes moved to each of the 5 cadets in front of him and returned to the center position. The review of the remaining cadets in this session is currently determined to require no action. That determination is contingent on conduct going forward, including the conduct of these interviews. He said, "Dismissed." They went. The door closed again. He turned to Ruth. She was still at the left side of the room near the wall. She had listened to what he said with her hands at her sides and her face doing nothing particular. The face she maintained in the corridor when the work was the work and the work was what there was. Listening to her own record delivered in that register in a room she had cleaned 42 times was a specific experience she had no category for, which meant she did not try to put it in a category and simply allowed it to be the experience that it was. He did not say anything for a moment. He was looking at her with the directness he had been looking at her with since he came through the door. The particular directness of someone who has decided that looking at the person in front of them is what the situation calls for, and is committed to it without the performance of eye contact that turns looking into something else. "I didn't know you were at Halcourt," he said. Not accusatory, not apologetic, a statement of fact about the limits of his knowledge. "No," she said, "you wouldn't." "How long?" 3 years in March. He looked at the room's floor for a moment, a brief displacement of his gaze, and then back. "You've been cleaning this building for 3 years?" "Yes." He took that in. The disposal team behind Ruth was working quietly at the table. The sounds of their instruments on the device's components, a methodical inventory, and the rustle of their case. Otherwise, The room was very quiet. He reached into his jacket's interior pocket and brought out a coin. He held it in his palm and extended his hand, the coin flat on his palm facing up. It was a challenge coin, EOD designation, the standard issue for the service's qualified specialists. But this one was an older production, the finish worn at the high points of the relief design, the type issued in a run that ended over 15 years ago. He had had it for a while. Ruth looked at it. She put her right hand into the front pocket of her work vest. The three-fingered hand, the glove over it, working into the pocket's interior. She withdrew a coin. She held it between her thumb and her index finger where he could see it. It was the same designation, the same older production. The finish on hers was worn further than his, the relief design on the obverse almost smooth at its high points, the edge showing the small indentations of long contact with other objects in the same pocket over many years. The laminated name tag on her supply cart read, Keller, R. The coin read what it read. She had not needed it from anyone. It had come with her, in her pocket, the same as every other morning she had come through this building's main entrance. He looked at her coin. He looked at it for several seconds. He closed his hand around his own coin and returned it to his interior jacket pocket. She returned hers to her vest pocket. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of a silence that arrives after the thing that needed to be said has been said by means other than speech, which is a different quality from the silence of two people who have nothing to say. "We should have made it harder to walk away," he said. She looked at him without redirecting her gaze. The statement landed where it was meant to land, which was in the space between them, rather than at her specifically, addressed to a situation rather than to a person. She understood what it was. It was not an apology. It was not a compliment. It was an acknowledgement that a thing had been true, stated without qualification or caveat. "You didn't make it easy to stay," she said. He received that the same way she had received his statement, without redirecting his gaze, without adding to it, without defending against it. It was accurate, and he knew it was accurate, and he let the accuracy of it be what it was. The disposal team leader spoke from the table, a short professional summary. The device had been fully discharged. The base assembly was confirmed inert. The capacitor was drained. No secondary concerns. They would transport it for full inspection and documentation as per protocol. DeGrange acknowledged this without turning from Ruth. The disposal team packed their case and moved to the door. The disposal team leader held the door, and both of them went through it into the corridor. The door closed with its soft hydraulic resistance. The room was empty except for the two of them, and the device on the table, and the paper clips on the laminate surface, and the mirror beside them. DeGrange said, "If there's anything the Academy can offer you, formally or otherwise, I would like to know." Ruth thought about this. She thought about it with genuine attention, which she gave to it because it deserved genuine attention rather than an automatic response. She was aware during the few seconds of thinking of the room around her, the smell of it, close air and bodies and the chemical aftermath of the lockdown's adrenaline chemistry dissipating, and under that the cleaning solution from the morning's floor work, and under that the older smell of the building itself, paper and metal and the accumulated residue of an institution that had been operating in this building for many decades before she came to it. She was aware of the overhead lights running their warm cycling pulse. She was aware of the corridor outside the door through the narrow window, the mop still leaning at the wall, the clock above the water fountain, the high windows with the late morning light coming through at its changed angle. "No," she said, and then, "Thank you." He nodded once, a small movement, not a bow and not a formal nod, but simply the downward movement of a head that is acknowledging something it has decided to accept. He moved to the door. He held it open with one hand on the door's edge, and he looked back at her once, a brief look, the kind of look that is not asking anything and is not leaving anything, just marking the fact of the room and the moment and the person in it before moving out of it. He went through the door closed. Ruth stood in the room for a moment after. The device was on the table with its base panel open on its hinge, the assembly visible inside, all of it discharged and inert. The two paper clips were on the laminate surface where she had set them, beside the mirror. The overhead lights ran their cycle. The clock in the corridor ticked through the door. She picked up the mirror. She folded it on its pivot and collapsed the telescoping handle to its minimum length and carried it to the instructor's supply kit, still on the instructor's desk where Obina had left it. And she set the mirror back in the kit's right section where it had been. She did not take anything from the room that she had not brought into it. The paper clips were from the room's own supplies. She left them on the table surface. She went to the door and pressed the lever handle and came out into the corridor. The corridor was in the late morning quality of light, the overhead fluorescents still running but competing now with the outdoor light coming through the high windows at an angle that had moved significantly from the early morning position. The early morning light had come through the windows as thin, low bands, arriving below the windowsill's angle and laying flat along the linoleum in narrow strips. The late morning light came through at a higher angle and produced broad rectangles on the floor, falling across the corridor from the window side in overlapping sections that reached nearly to the cabinet doors on the left wall. The light was warmer in register than the overhead fluorescence, a truer white than the light's blue-white, and where the two light sources overlapped on the linoleum surface, the combined effect showed the floor's true color for the first time in the day, a warm gray rather than the silver the fluorescence alone produced. Nufor was in the corridor. He was standing near the training room door, not in a deliberate position, not placed there with purpose. He had come through the door with the others when they were dismissed and had not gone far, the same not going far that had characterized his movements throughout the morning. The others had continued toward the main entrance junction. Nufor was still in the training room wing, approximately 10 feet from the door. He was looking at the mop, not directly. His gaze was in the general area of the wall where the mop leaned against the baseboard, the same area of the corridor where Ruth's supply cart sat, and the mop among these things received the same peripheral quality of attention that the cart and the wall and the corridor in general received. He was not studying the mop. He was simply standing in the place where the mop was also present, which was the corridor outside the training room, and his attention had gone toward the wall, the way attention goes toward a fixed point when the mind is occupied elsewhere. When Ruth came through the door, he turned. He looked at her. She looked at him. This took approximately 2 seconds and contained, in those 2 seconds, the inventory of the morning. The group coming through the main entrance at 7:15, the corridor and the glove and the bucket, the classroom and what he had watched from the left end of the front row, what he had seen in her hands on the device, and what he had understood about what he was seeing, and what he had not understood, and had simply let be what it was. He did not have a sentence. She watched him arrive at the edge of several sentences and stop before any of them. She recognized this. She had seen it in the corridor when he had looked at the water on the floor and his mouth had opened and then closed. He was doing the same thing now, arriving at the edge and finding the edge insufficient for what the thing needed to be. He looked at the mop. then at her. He moved to the training room door and took hold of it, the door she had just come through, and he held it open. This was not a large gesture. The door had already been in the open position when she came through it, and would have stayed open another few seconds on its hydraulic closer before pulling shut. His holding it added approximately 5 seconds to the opening and moved the door from a closing position back to a full open position. 5 seconds and a changed angle. Ruth maneuvered the supply cart through the door's opening, the bucket and the cart's lower rack clearing the door frame with the same clearance they always had. And she came into the corridor's full light, and the cart's front left wheel wobbled in its established way to the left, and she applied the correction automatically. She did not thank him. Not because she did not register what he had done. She registered it completely, the 5 seconds and the changed angle and everything they contained. But the exchange that had passed between them since the corridor's early morning did not have a debt structure to it. There was nothing he had done this morning that she had not already absorbed and continued from, and nothing she had done that required him to account for. The door was a door. He had held it. She moved the cart into the corridor, and he let the door close behind her. She heard his footsteps going toward the main entrance junction, their weight on the linoleum diminishing with distance. The corridor clock ticked. The water fountain dripped. She stood with the cart for a moment. She oriented herself to the corridor the way she oriented herself every morning when she entered a new section. Taking the current conditions, the light, the surface, what had been done, and what remained. What remained was a section between the training room door and the main entrance junction. The third section, the center. She had completed the first section and the second section and had been in the third section when the relay click pulled her away from the work. The third section had been interrupted but not completed. The linoleum between the training room door and the main entrance junction still had this morning's first pass cleaning only, and the floor in front of the training room door itself had the specific condition of a floor that had been heavily trafficked during an emergency. Multiple people moving through it in both directions at a pace that left marks the first pass had not covered. She unwound the mop from the bucket's side where she had braced it before walking away from it. Worked the mop head back to a proper working position. Checked the bucket's water level, under a quart still. She needed to refill. She took the cart to the utility supply room at the east end, past the supply office. Hendrick was in the supply office when she passed, visible through the open door, doing his routing inventory of the shelves. He looked up when she passed. He looked at her with the same expression he had used the first time she walked past him, after someone had said something to her in the corridor, or done something to her supplies, which had happened twice in her 3 years in this building. And both times his expression had been the same. A brief pause in whatever he was doing, a look in her direction, and then a return to whatever he was doing. He did not say anything then, and he did not say anything now. She did not require anything from the expression. It was what it was, which was a person in a building acknowledging that he knew what kind of morning it had been, in the economy of people whose jobs kept them in the background of the building's main operations. She filled the bucket at the utility sink, measured the concentrate, capped the bottle, returned it to the shelf. She brought the cart back to the third section. The corridor at 10:47 in the morning had the texture of a building that had passed through something and had reorganized around what came after. The overhead lights ran the same as they always ran. The clock above the water fountain ran the same. The cabinet doors were the same cabinet doors. The scuff mark near the training room door that the work order had not yet addressed was still there. The same dark arc at baseboard level. The same structural condition of the linoleum, rather than a deposit on its surface. The lifted seam near the water fountain was still lifted. None of the building's material conditions had changed during the morning's events. What had changed was the light and the quality of the building's sound. The light was the late morning light, the broad rectangles through the high windows, the warm white competing with the blue-white of the overhead fixtures and producing the day's truest color rendering on the floor. She had worked this section many mornings, and she knew what this light did to the floor, and how to read the floor in this light, which was different from how she read it in the early morning's thin slanted bands. This light showing the surface more completely, and at the same time casting the shadows of the window frames across the floor in ways that could obscure the assessment of a section if you let the shadows function as information rather than as light conditions to be accounted for. The quality of the building's sound was different from the 630 quality. There were more sources, and they were more varied. The administrative offices at the building's front had people in them now, the kind of activity that the morning's event had generated on the administrative side. Voices, a phone, a door opening and closing. The corridor outside the training room wing was quieter because the session had been dismissed, but it had a residual quality, the particular acoustic texture of a space that has recently been occupied by people under stress, which left something in the air that was not precisely sound, but registered in the same perceptual channel. She ran the first pass of the third section. Left wall side, cabinet adjacent. The mop head worked the baseboard gap the way it always did, the slight angle away from the wall that the handle's bracing position required. She worked it from the main entrance junction end toward the training room door end. The section was 28 feet, 6 inches of overlap per pass, 3 passes total. She found in this pass the places where the heavy foot traffic of the morning's emergency had left marks on the surface that the first pass had not been there to address. Near the training room door, the marks were heavier. The entry and exit of multiple people at speed on a floor that had been recently wet from the first pass left a composite condition that the wet mop addressed differently than it addressed dry linoleum. She worked it without changing her speed. The mop addressed what the mop addressed. The condition of the floor was the condition of the floor, and it responded to the work the same way it always responded. The second pass, right wall side, window adjacent. The late morning light through the high windows fell on this section in its broad rectangles, and she worked in the light without being impeded by it, reading the floor not from the light's testimony about the surface, but from the mop head's resistance and the angle of her peripheral view that found the dry lines at the pass's outer edge. She kept the overlap, 6 inches each pass. She had been doing this for a long time, longer than 3 years at Hellcourt, longer than any particular address, in various configurations that were not always custodial work, but involved the same essential operations: maintaining surfaces, managing what was present and what was absent, understanding what a space needed to be what it was supposed to be, and providing it. She had come to custodial work from something else, and had found that the skills transferred more directly than she had expected, which had not been a surprise exactly, but had been a confirmation of something she had understood without having had the opportunity to test. What the work required was the same at its foundation, regardless of what the work was: patience, attention, the willingness to do a thing correctly when incorrectly would serve as well for the purpose of an observer. The third pass, center, longest of the three. She worked it from the training room end toward the main entrance junction, moving away from the training room and toward the building's front. The center of the corridor was where the morning's foot traffic had been most concentrated, and the surface here showed it, but the concentration was not damage. It was use. The floor had been used, and the use was evident, and the mop was addressing it, which was the correct sequence. Use, evidence of use, maintenance. This was the sequence this corridor had been running through since before she arrived in it, and it would continue running through it after she left. And what she contributed to the sequence was the maintenance pass, the 6-inch overlap, the 3-point grip adjusted 15 degrees off parallel on the handle to account for the right hand's available contact points. The scuff mark near the training room door went past under the mop head and stayed. The work order was in the queue. She reached the main entrance junction end and completed the third pass. She stood at the junction end of the third section and looked back along it. The floor held the late morning light along its full length, the warm white rectangles from the high windows, and the blue-white overhead fluorescence, and between them, the gray linoleum showing its true color for the hour it received this combined illumination. The surface was even. The cabinet doors on the left wall ran their length without gap. The clock above the water fountain marked its seconds in their individual ticks. The fountain dripped at its 8-second interval. The third section was complete. She began the fourth section, the supply corridor that ran east from the main junction. This was the shorter section, 50 feet, lower traffic, and she moved through it at the same pace. Hendrick had already completed his supply run. The supply office door was now closed, and the supply corridor was empty and quiet. Her footsteps on the linoleum were the only footsteps. The bucket's front left wheel wobbled, and she applied the correction. She came back through the fourth section and re-entered the main corridor at the junction. The window side wall section remained, the fifth and final, running back from the junction toward the east stairwell at the far end of the corridor. She had started this section early this morning, and it had not needed to be interrupted. The interruption had been in the third section, the training room side. The fifth section was the right-hand wall, the window side, the faded lighter linoleum, and she worked it from the junction toward the east stairwell in the 2 passes it required. First pass from junction to stairwell. Return pass from stairwell back toward junction, picking up the outer edge dry lines. On the return pass, somewhere between the east stairwell door and the water fountain, she paused. Not because she had not finished the pass. The remaining distance to the junction end was still 8 or 10 feet ahead of her. She paused because she was listening. She had been listening at a level below the level of conscious decision to the building sounds since she re-entered the main corridor from the supply wing. The same monitoring that ran continuously during her mop route and was not an added activity but a background one. The building sounded the way it sounded when its ordinary operations had resumed after a disruption. The administrative voices were still present from the front section. A door on the floor above opened and closed. The clock ticked. The fountain dripped. The ventilation fan ran at its daytime setting. There was no relay click. There had not been one since the catch depressed in the training room. The building sounds were the building sounds, and nothing in them required her to stop and attend to them. She was pausing not to listen to something present, but to confirm the absence of something. The way you touch a surface to confirm it is cool before you stop thinking about whether it is cool. The way you listen to a building after a lockdown to hear whether it has returned to itself or whether it is still running a different mode under the surface of its ordinary sounds. The building was running its ordinary sounds. It was running them the way it ran them on any ordinary Thursday in the season, the ventilation on its daytime cycle, and the administrative wing at its working frequency, and the corridor in its mid-morning condition of post-session quiet, and the clock marking its discrete seconds. She resumed the final section of the pass. 8 feet, then 10 feet, then the junction. She completed the overlap. The mop head came to the junction corner and she stopped. 5th section complete. That was the last section. She wrung the mop in the bucket. She checked the cart's supply level. She looked down the corridor at the 5 completed sections, the full 230 feet, from the main entrance junction where she had started at 6:19 to the east stairwell end where the 5th section ran out. The floor held the light. She positioned the mop handle against the cart's side and took the bucket to the utility sink at the east end to dispose of the working solution, which was the final step. The solution went down the drain and she rinsed the bucket and rinsed the mop head over the sink and squeezed the mop head to the 90% dryness that the storage position required. She returned the cart to the corridor and ran the mop over the small section of floor between the cart's position and the utility room's door that the bucket's transport had marked. 1 pass, pickup only. She positioned the cart in its storage position in the supply corridor's alcove, where it stood between sessions. She confirmed the cart's wheel brake was engaged. She checked the supply levels. Cleaning solution, adequate. Backup cloths, 2 remaining, adequate. Detail brush, present. She noted the mop head's condition, which after this morning's work was at the edge of its replacement threshold, but had not crossed it. She would assess tomorrow. She came out of the supply corridor and into the main corridor. The full length of it ran from the main entrance junction on her left to the east stairwell door on her right. 230 feet in both directions from where she stood at the supply corridor's opening, near the corridor's midpoint. The overhead fluorescent columns ran their even white. The high windows gave the late morning rectangles of warm light. The clock above the water fountain read 10 minutes past 11. The water fountain dripped. She put her right hand into the front pocket of her work vest and felt the coin with her thumb. She did not take it out. She let her thumb rest against its surface, the worn high points of the relief design, and then she moved her thumb away and withdrew her hand from the pocket, and she walked toward the main entrance junction. At the junction, she turned right, back into the training room wing's corridor. The mop was still against the wall at the angle she had set it, the same angle as always, handle tilted, mop head against the baseboard, gravity holding it in place. The corridor outside the training room was quiet. The training room door was closed, the disposal team gone, the session not yet rescheduled. The scuff mark at the baseboard was where it had been. The afternoon's first light would come through the high windows at the changing angle of the season's progression, a little lower today than yesterday, a little more easterly in its entry point. She would be in a different section by then. She picked up the mop. She settled the handle in her right hand. The 3-point grip adjusted to the 15-degree angle, the one that compensated for what the hand was and worked with what it had. She moved the mop head to the training room door's immediate vicinity and began working the section of corridor she had left unfinished when the relay click pulled her away. The pass went left from the training room door toward the main junction. The mop head moved in its 6-inch overlap. The handle weight distributed correctly across the 3 contact points. The floor addressed correctly, the solution lifting the morning's last unworked section and leaving the surface at the condition the surface was meant to be at. She worked without looking up. She worked without listening for anything in particular because there was nothing to listen for. The building was running its Thursday sounds, and the corridor was running its late morning light, and the clock was running its ticks, and the fountain was running its 8-second drip, and the floor in front of the mop head was showing her what it was showing her, which was a surface doing the ordinary work of a floor in a building that continued to be what it was. She reached the main entrance junction. She turned the mop for the return pass. The front left wheel of the bucket wobbled in its established way, and she applied the correction without looking at it. She kept going.